Take This Waltz. Prologue. There is a world that isn't so different than yours. Everything is exactly the same. The sun still creeps up the horizon every morning and still drifts back down at dusk. There are still 7 continents: Africa, North America, South America, Asia, Antarctica, Australia, and Europe. Humans still roam the earth. They've still built large empires and conquered distant lands. Everything is exactly the same. Except for one thing. There was a little something more than just humans. Since the dawn of humanity, this other species has worked alongside them in harmony. Since the early man, the ancient Egyptians, China, Persia, Mongols, Rome, everything, these other people have helped humanity. The species is very different from anything you've ever seen before. They possess magic so subtle it still appears to be human. And while they are individuals themselves, their personality is complicated. It's more of the sum of thoughts of many ordinary people than anything. They are less of a singular person and more of a group. They are known as countries. Their whole purpose is to represent the nation of their people. They are the Countryhumans. They appear to look human, but one thing would stand out. Their face would appear normal if their skin wasn't colored in the pattern of their flag. I know the feeling of wishing things could be the way they were once is relatable, but I don't think it could be easily felt in the measures I felt then. I know everyone in Europe would say the same thing, but for myself and my fellow Countryhumans, the feeling must have been amplified. I was known as Germany, or the German Empire, and I once wished things could be the way they were, as the World War I raged. I wished things could be normal again, and I could go home. But if there was one thing I had learned in my many years of living, I know that wishing gets you absolutely nowhere. Hope had never been my friend. As I now reflect on my life, I wish that I may have a do-over. I dream that I may start again and make the right choices, even if it hurts. But no matter what, a wish is just that. It's nothing more than a wish. Sometimes back on the Western Front, I imagine that I was back at the beginning. Back in a time where things were simply just better. Back when I had first met her. Chapter 1. The year was 1879. The cobblestone streets still saw the bustle of carriages and the clap of horse hooves, for cars were more rare. The Beethoven music still drifted through the air out of the concert halls. Everyday life seemed to be just fine for the young Countryhuman known as the German Empire. That was his name officially, but he preferred to go by Johann. Just 8 years earlier marked the date when his father Prussia, also known as Hermann, allowed him to rule some of his land. He knew that he was blessed that his relationship with his father did not entail wars or revolutions like many of the other Countryhumans he had heard of. Johann didn't know how he found himself here. He had only been traveling to Austria for some quick amusement in the beautiful city of Vienna. And honestly, he genuinely wanted to see what this palace banquet was all about. They wouldn't dare turn him down because of his country status. He was not normal, per se. His face was colored in the black, white, and red horizontal stripes of the German flag. Everyone he met in the street avoided eye contact with him or went out of their way so they didn't have to make conversation. It wasn't because they hated him, obviously, but because they were intimidated. Intimidated by the fact that the Countryhumans were like gods compared to them. Johann had a theory that subconsciously people are intimidated by people they wouldn't be able to hypothetically kill, even if they were a peaceful person, which is why people are often intimidated by muscular people, because they are well aware that if they got in a fight with them, they would surely lose miserably. And everyone knew that it was impossible for a normal human to kill a Countryhuman. They were immortal, and it took very special circumstances for them to die. Their military had to be weak, their soldiers had to be tired, and their society had to be on the brink of collapse. Finally, the person who had to kill them could only be another country. He guessed that even if he wasn't country, they still might be intimidated, for he towered over people and been told he'd been rather scary to be around. So he figured he'd be let into the party almost automatically, and he was, except as soon as he stepped in the ballroom, he was about ready to leave. This was because as he immediately almost bumped into another person. Unfortunately, not just any person, but the one and only countryhuman for France, in all her glory. He hated France for the passion, and the feeling was mutual. Francine, he grumbled. She narrowed her eyes at him and cut him off when he began to speak once more. Small world. She didn't wait for the answer. Mind telling me why you're out of your own country, Johann? I could ask you the same, he replied, using the unimpressed monotone voice she had used on him. She crossed her arms. Not your information to know. Then keep the same attitude. He felt satisfaction at her scoff. Whatever, just get away from here before war starts or something. As she started to walk away, he couldn't help but take one more jab at her. We do know how much you like starting those. She whipped her head around to look at him, face retracted into a snarling expression. You weren't even born yet when Napoleon was around, you little runt. She shook a fist at him. She looked like she wanted to say something else, but spitefully decided against it. Instead, the female country just stomped on the ground, flailing the dress, and walked away. Johann sighed. He didn't understand Francine. He turned to look back at her as she took her leave, and laughed in his head slightly at her discomfort with her dress. See, France was a republic, something he didn't understand. He had been raised by a kingdom, and he was a monarchy himself. She was also the most unladylike person he had ever met. She acted positively like a wacky, drunk man. Of course, that was only a few reasons why they didn't see eye to eye. Another big factor was probably because the whole reason he ruled was because France and a few other countries lost a war against his father, the countrywoman for Prussia, and she wasn't very happy. He was pretty sure that relations with her would never be restored. On the contrary, now he really wanted to leave this party, but like hell he would ever show weakness to Francine of all horrible people. Guess I'm stuck here until France leaves. God, he hoped it would be soon. Trying to forget the interaction he just had with a certain lady, the German country walked into the rest of the ballroom. He took a few moments to marvel at the beauty that lay before him. Polished stone pillars glistened, towering up to the high ceiling. Their pale complexion seemed to reflect the light that came from the many large circular chandeliers, holding up hundreds of candles that projected their yellow light down below to the dancers. Pink and orange lights streamed in from the sunset from great windows that covered almost the entire wall. The sound of music and tapping feet filled the light air as 10 pretty women danced with their partners. Smells of the banquet ran through the room, coming from a long table filled with food, people, and distant chatter. Deciding that he would likely be unwelcome at the table, considering he had no clue what the occasion was, the umpire settled to standing by the end of a window. He formally put his hands behind his back, a pose he quite liked. It aided him with authority and purpose, even when he didn't have it. It also made him unapproachable. No one would dare talk to a person who stood like they had something better to do. Another thing he prided himself on was his impeccable posture when he stood. His back was even sturdier than that of his father's. Not that his father did as intentionally as he did. As time went on, Johann slowly turned to look out the window. Towards the edge of his view, outside, he saw a pretty garden with some trees, all lush with greenery. All except for one, which shut out from the rest of the trees with its twisty dead branches. It looked like a tree where the doves would go to die. As the music faded out, the umpire turned back away from the window to check if Francine was still there. To his displeasure, she was indeed, and talking to a certain British countryhuman. A lovely waltz started playing, replacing the silence at the end of the previous song had left. He noticed that many more people were now coming to dance, and he also saw that there was no unoccupied lady whom he could take to dance to pass the time. Maybe that was for the better, because they probably wouldn't want to dance with the country anyways. Deciding to spice things up, Johann migrated his standing spot over a couple of pillars. He caught himself bobbing his head to the music slightly and quickly cut it out. That didn't look very professional. Sighing, he turned to face the side, not wanting to look at the people enjoying themselves, when he spotted something red and green. Not just a thing, but a person. He peered around the pillar, and then he saw her. The Austro-Hungarian dual empire countryhuman sat there on a bench, wearing a stunning white layered dress with fancy silver lace. Her deep brown hair was in a tight braid, curly tendrils hung down in front of her ears, and she sat with elegance. Her unique flag design was enviable, dotting not one but two crests on her face. Growing up with a simple flag of 3 lines of color, the young German country had always been jealous of his father's flag that he had worn in a crest on an eye patch. Interestingly, Austro-Hungary's eyes seemed to be either covered up by a crest or be the crest themselves, which raised some questions about whether or not she could see him staring at her, or see anything at all. All of this distracted him from the very last thing he noticed her about there that day. She looked quite sad. It took him a moment to notice that her head was directed at a certain pair that was dancing to the waltz. So she can see. And that's where his mind got tricky with him. After all, he was only still here because he wasn't backing down to France. He didn't plan on even talking to anyone else, but here was a lady who he could actually approach, who looked like she wanted to dance. He personally understood the rejection from interacting with normal people. Every country did. He assumed that this party had something to do with her, so why should she be secluded from everyone else? Because she's different. Knowing this, Johann walked around the pillar fully. She noticed him as soon as he walked in front of her, and her head perked up. She stood, but waited for him to say something first, considering he engaged their interaction. Not knowing what else to do, the male umpire got down on one knee and took her hand in both of his. Then he leaned in and kissed it slowly. He felt people watching them, and he would probably bet that France was one of those people. "May I take this waltz?" he asked, keeping his cool. Austro-Hungary looked shocked. Her face turned slightly pink. For a moment the German wondered if he had somehow offended her or had been too forward. He felt relief wash over his body as she smiled. Taking that as initiative, he stood up and grasped her thin hand within his own, trying to be gentle, for he knew he had a killer grip. In response, she placed her other hand on his shoulder, and he followed by putting his on her waist. They both simultaneously backed away from the wall and started to dance to the waltz with practiced ease. The German took the lead, dancing his partner around, her dress gliding across the shiny tile floor. It looked like a white rose. Once in a while, she would smoothly move her right hand to slightly lift up her dress, so she wouldn't trip. They swung in circles, making sure to move in the same direction as the other dancers. As the music came to a perk, he quickly moved both his hands to her waist and lifted her into the air. She was ready for it and already placed both her hands on his shoulders. As she came down, he continued to spin to the music. His heart skipped a beat when she noticed that she couldn't stop smiling. Then he realized that he was also smiling. The music continued, so they did as well. Her braid bounced around as they waltzed across the flooring, and her silver lace sparkled in the light. A brilliant blaze of orange shot across the ballroom as the sun continued to set. Their enlarged shadows projected their perfect dancing form and filled up the flooring. When Johann turned at a certain angle, he could see Francine still talking to the British countryhuman, William. Not that he was disappointed anymore, now that he was having the time of his life. He had rarely gone out as a child, or even as an adult really. His father had him toured from their home when he was young. He was appreciated at least that he learned many skills. Dancing happened to be one of them, and it was nice to have a relationship with a normal human, even if they were being paid to be him. He knew and understood from early on that being a countryhuman wasn't easy. It wasn't easy to be immortal, to be forced to sit back and watch change. Even more, you had to accept it. He hadn't been around for long by countryhuman standards, and he'd only been in actual country for 8 years now. But he knew that he'd have to go through the pain of living through king after king as they are born, grow old, and die. And he knew his responsibility, sort of. Although one responsibility he was afraid of was what he needed to do for the future regime. Despite being basically immortal, countryhumans still died regularly. That would be only if the regime itself came to an end. The German knew he needed to achieve an heir sooner or later. The birth process for Countryhumans was rather peculiar. Sure, they could be born like a normal human, but more often than not, they would simply just appear. That was how he was born. His father told him that he came home one night to see a random baby German Empire just sitting there on the floor. His older siblings, the North German Confederacy and the Saxe-Weimar-Eisenach, came to be in the same way, although his brother, the Confederacy, whom he knew as Fritz, had sadly passed almost 20 years earlier. At least his sister, who just went by Eisenach, was still around. Someday his regime would fall, and he would need someone else to represent the German people, and as far as he knew, said person was yet to come. He personally didn't think he'd make a very good father. Before he realized, the sun had set under the horizon, and the windows were dark, yet they kept on dancing. France was long gone. He could leave, but he wasn't going to abruptly let Austria-Hungary attend to her own self. In the end, she was the one to stop the dance. She was out of breath, and he was too. As they sat down next to each other, she giggled. "Thank you. I really needed that," she said, her voice sweet like honey. Johann smiled reflexively at the sound. "I definitely enjoyed it as well. You're the German Empire, correct?" "Indeed, but my normal name is Johann, and you're the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right?" She nodded. "You can call me Gloria. That was really kind of you to do, especially because I know our fathers never got along with each other." But you're different," he pointed out. "I wish Francine would think things like that." He mumbled the last part, mostly to himself, but Gloria laughed anyways, clearly getting the joke. He chuckled along with her. After she caught her breath, she informed him that she was going to head to the lavatory. "I should quickly get her some flowers or something before she comes back," he thought, quickly. He then suddenly remembered that there was a flower vendor close in town. Knowing that ladies take forever in the washroom, he quickly walked straight out of the palace. The sky was darkening quickly, and the vendors were probably long gone. He prayed that wasn't the case as he navigated the cobble roads. The wooden buildings around him blurred together when he broke out into a run, a barely visible shadow below him from the twilight moon. He sharply turned around a few street corners before he made it to where he saw the seller earlier. To his extremely good fortune, the flower seller was the last vendor on the street, though he had already walked a good distance away from where he was before, pushing his cart of flowers. Forgetting how informal he was being, the German yelled, "Wait!" as he continued running after the man. The man turned around to face him, and when he noticed what he was talking to, he immediately stiffened and held a shocked face. He cautiously looked as the Empire stopped to catch his breath right in front of him. After a few seconds of silence, Johann spoke up. "Sir, may I buy some flowers?" Bewildered that the German Empire had chased him down for that, the man took a bit to answer, and when he did, he got it out with a stutter. Of course, Your Majesty. Country? Empire?" Instead of correcting him, Johann continued. "I really am in a tight time limit. Just hand me anything I've read, and I'll pay for it." The man complied immediately, handing him a bunch of roses. The Empire reached into his pockets before realizing. Do you take gold marks?" The man looked at him confused. "I take Corona. I do not take German currency." "Damn it," German Empire swore under his breath. The human waved his hands. "But no need, sir," he said a bit too loudly. "Just take it." "Really?" the Country asked. But the seller was already bolting down the road. That's when the German realized that he was also short on time. He stuffed the bouquet into his back pocket and hastily made his way back over to the palace. When he arrived at the palace, Gloria was waiting for him on the bench where they had sat before. He approached her quickly, not wanting to make her wait longer. "Oh, were you in the washroom as well?" she asked when he arrived. "Sure," he said awkwardly, unable to think of anything else. "So, anyways," he started, his face showing a reddish color. Deciding there was no point delaying it, he pulled out the rose bunch. The female gasped. "Wow," she exclaimed. "Thank you so much." She smiled excitedly when she looked down at the flowers. "Glad you like them." "So that's why you're out of breath." He chuckled and blushed harder. Noticing that the music was still playing, he held her hand and kissed it once again. "I take this waltz?" he asked. "Take this waltz with a clamp on its jaws." And then they stood up and began to dance once more. Gloria hadn't had that much fun in ages. The German Empire wasn't at all what she had expected. He seemed almost perfect. Not only was he handsome, but he definitely had his charm. She'd bet he wasn't facing nearly as many troubles with ruling his own empire as she was. Well, if she really was even in power. She didn't get to be fully in charge. She was a dual empire after all. She technically only existed because her parents needed to make peace with each other. A while back, her father, the Austrian Empire, had complete control over all their land, and her mother, while being of the species of countryhuman, wasn't really a country back then. Her mother, Hungary, had been more or less just a representative of an ethnicity, and she was ruled completely by Austria. The story goes that in the late 1840s, she had a violent revolution against Austria that she almost won. Later, when Prussia had backed Austria into a corner, she took advantage of that to gain sovereignty, except peacefully this time. Now Gloria was technically in charge. Both her parents were the real ones behind things, because they still ruled their own nations separately. The two parts of her both spoke different languages and had different passports. They had their own constitutions and made their own executive decisions. Gloria only got to be in charge of foreign affairs. She knew that her parents were taking the great burden of governing for her, but she also knew it was for selfish reasons. Now, the German Empire seemed to be destined for a great future. He was tall, ruled all by himself, and such a gentleman. Gloria could only hope they could become closer, maybe even allies, or something more. When she arrived back at her own palace, the sun was already beginning to rise, and her heart was still fluttering in her chest after a long night of dancing with the charming German. She practically skipped into the dining room, hugging the bouquet of roses she had been given. "Wow, you were outright," her father of the Austrian Empire, also known as Bernhard, chuckled when he noticed how excited she was. Must have been an exquisite ball. He sat at the head of a long wooden table, sipping a cup of his early morning tea. "What's with the flowers?" her mother, Hungary, who was called Dorica, asked, sitting at the other end of the table, drinking from a goblet. "Did you meet someone?" She smirked. Gloria felt her cheeks heat up. "No need to worry. I'm not going to stop you from meeting with humans," her father said. "I'd like to know of this daring young man who asked out a country," her mother added, sounding impressed that any human would ever do such a thing. He's not a human," Gloria said, but too loudly out of embarrassment, sitting down into one of the chairs. At those words, both her parents raised their eyebrows. "What country is he? Better not be Russia. Is he from the Balkans?" She raised her hands and waved them in an attempt to get them to stop attacking her with questions. "No," she said. "Just tell us who, then," her mother said, eagerly. Her father nodded, taking a sip from his cup. The dual monarchy blushed harder. Well," she said, knowing what she was about to say was going to sound strange. "It was the German Empire. Johann, actually." Bernard almost spit out his morning tea, hearing the name his daughter just said. He managed to swallow it with enough effort before yelling, "What?" Dorica smirked at her husband. When the Austrian finally managed to catch his words, they came out in a yell. "You mean that jerk Herman's son? It's all his fault. I have to share my empire with her," he yelled, gesturing at his wife, whose expression turned from smug to angry at the comment. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Your empire? Last I checked, you and your ethnicity only make up 13% of the population." She made angry hand movements as she talked. "You never deserved to rule in the first place." "You're seriously still mad about all that stuff? And what does that have to do with German Empire?" Gloria asked, visibly annoyed at her parents. "If they're going to argue at all, why does it have to be the same thing every time?" Her father scoffed and straightened his uniform collar. The point is that you are going for the relationship with the son of a man who has wronged me very much. I'd say that it's quite rude and disrespectful to me as I'm your father." Her mother sighed. She placed her palm on her forehead. "My point is that she is going for a relationship with the son of a man who has helped me very much. I'd say that it's quite rude and disrespectful for you to deny her of such a date to me, as I am your wife, Austria," she said sternly. He groaned. "Fine, you win." The youngest Empire covered her glowing cheeks with her hands. "I never said we were in a relationship." "But you want to be one, do you not?" Dorica asked her hot daughter. The Austro-Hungarian Empire nodded. "What did you two even do?" her father scoffed, pouring himself another cup of tea. She considered the question for a moment. "Well, he asked me to dance, then he got me these flowers, and then we switched actively with dancing and talking until we decided to stop and head our separate ways." "That's it? Mom! Dorica! No need to make such vulgar suggestions at the dining table. I'm trying to drink my tea." "She comes home at sunrise after meeting a guy, and all they did was dance?" Hungary asked. "You've got to be pulling my leg." Bernard scowled and put a hand to his chest. "Our daughter is a country, Dorica. It's extraordinarily rude for you to make the assumption that she would ever engage in such vile behavior," he scolded, shutting his eyes in disbelief. "Haven't we raised her right? It simply isn't proper for her to attempt intercourse with a man she just met, let alone another country. She knows how much political issues that would raise if they were not already in a proper alliance." His wife breathed an annoyed sigh. "And how could you ever possibly have a clue? I'm asking her." He huffed angrily and crossed his arms. "Well then, Austria-Hungary, did you or did you not participate in sexual intercourse with this man?" "No! Then it has been settled," the Austrian Empire said in a deadpan. Dorica gave her daughter a serious look. "You are telling the truth, right?" "Yes." "Enough," her father said, bringing a fist to the table, making the few plates of biscuits clank. "I simply cannot continue to participate in this disturbing conversation, especially not at the table." He then proceeded to stand up, holding his teacup and saucer and bringing it with him. "Alas, I'm heading to the drawing room to finish my morning tea, as you seem insistent in this subject's continuation." After he had fully left the room, Hungary sighed. "Good heavens, thank God he's gone." Her daughter sat uncomfortably in her seat. "Now you swear nothing happened between you two?" "Yes, mother. I mean, he was quite charming and kind, but it wasn't that kind of attraction. We were also in a ballroom. Where do you expect us to find privacy for such a heinous act?" Hungary nodded, taking a drink from her goblet. "You have brought up a fair point indeed. Very well, then, I believe you." "Thank you." The German Empire hadn't arrived back in his own country for another couple of days, but he couldn't stop thinking about a certain someone. Not only was she absolutely stunning, but her empire was quite unique. The journey home had been more tiring than usual, despite the fact that he shared borders with Austria. Johann had the same king his father had, a man by the name of Otto von Bismarck, a rather respectable man with respectable feats. Because of this, he still lived in his childhood home with Prussia. Many countries lived in the same house as their parental country, sometimes taking care of their retired elder. Although that was quite rare, as many countries ruled because their parental country died and passed on the nation to the next regime. Johann considered himself quite lucky that something like that didn't happen to him to allow him to rule. A lot of countries he knew or had heard of had been left to pick up a collapsed nation, the collapse that killed their parental country. Well on track for a bright future, the young German couldn't help but fear if or when something like a collapse would happen to him. He knew that nothing lasts forever. Rome still fell after everything. Closing the large door behind him, the German Empire came into the family palace with a sigh. He definitely needed sleep. Unfortunately, it was only supper time, and turning in for the night would ruin his sleep schedule. He walked into the drawing room with a yawn and fell into one of the armchairs. How was the visit to Austria? Johann flinched, not knowing that there was someone else in the room. He looked over his shoulder to see Hermann, his father, sitting in the chair beside him, reading the newspaper. I suppose it was nice. Vienna was beautiful. It always is, his father said, putting the newspaper down. You look tired. What did you do there? He sighed. Explored the town a bit, crashed a party. When you did what now? Hermann said, raising his voice a bit. His son groaned. Well, not really crashed. I just kind of showed up. That's what party crashing is, Germany, he sighed. You didn't get into any trouble, did you? No. Then I suppose it's not a big deal, he said, turning to face the younger male. What was the party for? Johann rubbed his chin slightly. I don't know. It was some sort of ball and banquet. He stopped to debate if he should tell his father a specific detail that he was unable to stop thinking about. In the end, he decided there was no reason to keep such a thing. And I met someone, he continued, looking down at his folded hands in slight embarrassment. Who? The Austro-Hungarian Empire. His father scratched his head. What's that supposed to mean? You're sure she likes you back? I don't know what her parents have told you about you or I. Father, he started, she danced with me all night and accepted the flowers I gave her. Hermann still looked slightly on the fence. And what about you? What do you think? Are you sure she's right for you? And not just good for you as a person, but is she good for your nation? Now, the German Empire hadn't thought of that. It didn't hurt to have allies, but how useful would she be to him? Well, he started, gesturing vaguely. It's better to have a good relationship with other countries than to start a war with them. Hermann considered his words for a few seconds while scratching his chin. Very true, but in the end, you are more of a country than a person. You cannot forget that the choices you make in your life affect the lives of your subjects. You need to accept that. It's simply unprecedented that you make a decision because of personal reasons. If you are not currently in power, I would not say this to you, as it is a harsh truth. But for as long as you are the face of Germany, your preferences, private opinions, and anything you do for personal gain do not matter. And you should actively avoid doing or voicing anything of the sort. Remember, your life is not just your own. Johann looked away, trying to think of something to say in response. Hermann raised a finger. However, it is good for you to have allies. I support your yearning to this country, but make sure she's contributing the same amount that you are. You do not need toxic or incompetent allies. Got it, his son replied. I suggest talking about it with the king if you want to start an alliance. Johann nodded and looked up again. He went silent for a minute before he spoke up. Would you support a more serious relationship? Hermann grinned and made a move to pat his son on the shoulder, but it was more of a smack. Obviously, you took so long. You're lucky I didn't find a woman for you. The German Empire smiled.